Sometimes a government agency or a third party contracts with the landlord and tenant in order to subsidize the tenant's rent. In most cases, this means the landlord and tenant are required to follow not just the Arizona Residential Landlord-Tenant Act, but also their separate contracts and applicable federal regulations. There are many types of subsidized housing, including Section 8 housing choice vouchers, Section 8 project-based, and low-income housing tax credit programs. This video will focus on Section 8 housing choice vouchers. When a tenant qualifies for a voucher, the Housing Authority will issue a document that verifies the amount of rent that is due to the landlord and the amount they will pay on behalf of the tenant. The tenant with a Section 8 voucher is only responsible for their portion of the rent. The landlord and tenant are prohibited from making any side deals. A landlord may not demand from the tenant more than the tenant's portion of the rent already determined by Section 8. This means that as long as a tenant remains in the Section 8 program, a landlord cannot properly evict a tenant just because Section 8 fails to pay its portion of the rent. If a landlord seeks Section 8's part of the rent from the tenant can report the landlord to the HUD Fraud Hotline at 800-347-3745. If Section 8 fails to pay rent or pays their portion of rent late, the tenant is not responsible for the late fees on Section 8's portion of the rent, and the landlord can file a claim against Section 8. If an eviction action has been filed, the tenant should tell the judge if Section 8 has not paid its portion of the rent. Warning: you can be evicted if you have not paid your portion of the rent. From time to time, the portion of rent that the tenant is responsible for may change. Section 8 will issue a new form explaining when that change takes place and how much the tenant is responsible for paying each month. Housing quality standards inspections are inspections conducted by Section 8 to ensure the unit meets housing quality standards set by HUD. Periodically, Section 8 is required to conduct a housing quality standards inspection of the subsidized housing. If the unit doesn't pass the housing quality standards inspection, and it is the landlord's fault, Section 8 by law can't pay the landlord the rent for the month the unit failed the inspection. If the unit has failed due to the landlord, and Section 8 has not paid its portion of the rent, a landlord does not have the right to evict the tenant as long as the tenant has paid their portion of the rent. However, if the unit failed the inspection due to the tenant, and Section 8 terminates the voucher, the tenant will be required to pay the entire rent, and the landlord can evict the tenant. A tenant may lose the voucher for failing to comply with the program requirements. If that happens, the landlord and tenant will each receive a notice from Section 8 that will explain when the subsidy ends. The tenant will then be responsible for the full rent after that date. For other types of breaches, the landlord must provide a copy of the breach notice to Section 8. A landlord may not terminate a month-to-month lease with a Section 8 tenant without a valid reason. Those valid reasons are listed in the program requirements.